I never thought a strip of land could feel like a prison wall, but that's exactly what it became. It started one gray morning, the kind where the fog hangs low over the fields and even the birds seem reluctant to sing. I was sipping my first cup of coffee, staring out across the rolling expanse of my ranch, a place I'd poured 20 years of sweat, money, and heart into, when something caught my eye. A line, thin, metallic, and glinting in the weak sunlight. At first, I thought it was just the glimmer of dew on the grass. But then I noticed the shape. Straight, perfectly measured, and running exactly along the eastern boundary of my property. By the time I grabbed my boots and walked out to investigate, my heart was already pounding. The closer I got, the clearer it became. It wasn't a stray piece of wire or a surveyor's marker. It was a fence, and not just any fence, a brand new, powder-coated steel barrier. Cold, industrial, 2 meters high, no gate, no opening. It stood there like a warning, like an unspoken threat. Standing next to it was Robert Clay, the HOA president, 61 years old, tall, with a head of perfectly combed silver hair and the kind of pressed polo shirt that seemed allergic to a single wrinkle. He was the kind of man who smiled without warmth, who shook your hand like he was already calculating your weaknesses. Beside him was Marcia Green, the HOA secretary, 53, sharp eyes behind cat-eye glasses, always holding a clipboard, like her life depended on documenting yours. "Morning," Robert said, not looking at me, his gaze instead sweeping the line of the fence like he was admiring his own masterpiece. "What's this?" I asked, my voice flat, but my pulse quickening. "Boundary clarification," Marcia answered without missing a beat, scribbling something on her clipboard. "HOA Directive 12B. Protecting common access." Common access. My stomach tightened. That strip of land wasn't common anything. It was mine. My grandfather bought it in 1968. I paid the taxes on it every single year. My cattle grazed there. My tractor used that path to reach the far fields. "This is my property," I said, my voice rising. Robert finally looked at me. His eyes were calm, almost smug. "Property lines can be interpreted differently, Daniel. The HOA has reviewed the plats and determined this section falls under community oversight. We're simply ensuring it's maintained properly." Maintained. I wanted to laugh, but it came out more like a growl. "You built a fence. Without asking me. Without even telling me." "It's not personal," Robert said. "It's policy." That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about grass or property lines or maintenance. This was about control. About someone deciding they could redraw the map of my life and expect me to smile about it. But as I stood there, staring at that wall of steel cutting through my land, I couldn't help but think of the bigger question. What do you do when the people who claim to protect your neighborhood are the very ones stealing it from you? I didn't answer them that morning. I just walked back toward my house, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounding louder than it should have. Each step felt heavier, like the fence wasn't just blocking a path. It was cutting into me. The rest of the day blurred. Calls to the county office went unanswered. The surveyor I trusted was out of town for 2 weeks. My cattle grazed on one side of the fence, staring at me like they couldn't understand why I wasn't doing something. But I was doing something. I was thinking. And by the time the sun went down, I had a single, clear thought in my mind. If they wanted to build a fence, then fine. But fences work both ways. They keep people out, and sometimes they keep people in. I just hadn't decided which one this was going to be yet. That night, lying in bed, I replayed every encounter I'd ever had with Robert and Marcia. The friendly notices in my mailbox. The time they fined me for parking my truck too close to the road on my own driveway. The way Robert always managed to phrase threats like favors. They crossed a line, literally and figuratively. And I wasn't the type to let someone else write my ending. The next morning, the fence was still there, slicing across my land like an ugly scar. But this time, I didn't just see steel and bolts. I saw motive. You see, in my 20 years living under this HOA, I'd learned one thing. They never do anything without a reason. And when they wrap their reason in policy, it's usually to hide something bigger. So I started digging. I walked down to the far edge of my property, past the mesquite trees, where the fence ran along the eastern boundary. On the other side lay the so-called community green space, a patch of overgrown field no one ever used, except maybe the occasional dog walker. But here's the thing. That green space had been on the HOA's radar for years. They'd been floating ideas about selling it to a developer, talking about turning it into something beneficial for the community. Their words, not mine. I remember the last HOA meeting I'd attended, 6 months ago. Robert had been unusually animated, gesturing toward a projected map of the neighborhood. He'd spoken about maximizing shared assets and creating new revenue streams. I didn't think much of it at the time. Most of those meetings were filled with empty buzzwords. But now it made sense. That green space was worth money. Real money. And the quickest way to make it appealing to a developer was to control the access points. My land just happened to be one of them. I call my neighbor, George Martinez, 65 years old, retired mechanic, and one of the few people in this neighborhood who didn't drink the HOA's Kool-Aid. George had been here even longer than I had, and he'd seen his fair share of HOA games. George, I said, they put up a fence on my property. Claims it's community. Claims it's community land. He let out a low whistle. Let me guess, Robert and Marcia? Who else? Daniel. They've been sniffing around that side of your ranch for months. I've seen Robert out there with survey stakes more than once. Didn't think they'd be bold enough to go through with it, though. They did, and I think I know why. Green space. Green space. That was the first time I felt it, the anger turning into something colder. More focused. Because here's the truth no one wants to admit about HOAs. They love to sell their mission as protecting property values. But in reality, it's about power, control, pride. They convince themselves that they know better than you how to live on your own land. They'll fine you for your grass being half an inch too high, but they won't fix the pothole at the end of the street. They'll chase down a neighbor for painting their shutters the wrong shade of beige, but they'll ignore the guy down the road who lets his garage collapse into a pile of rotting wood. It's not about rules. It's about who gets to make them. And in this case, Robert had decided that my ranch, my livelihood, was just another chess piece in his game. I spent the rest of the week gathering information. I dug out my property deed and tax records. I pulled up the county's GIS mapping system and printed every plat that showed my eastern boundary. I even drove down to the county recorder's office and paid for certified copies. Every single one of them confirmed the same thing. The fence was on my land, not community land. Mine. But here's where it got tricky. The HOA had its own interpretation of the plats. And because the board had a lawyer on retainer, they could drag this out for months, maybe years in court. And while I'm not afraid of legal fight, I knew one thing about Robert Clay. He thrived on dragging things out. Every delay worked in his favor. Every meeting, every postponement, every we'll revisit this next month. Chipped away at your patience until most people just gave up. But I wasn't most people. That Friday, I spotted something that turned my suspicion into certainty. Marcia was out by the fence, clipboard in hand, as always, talking to a man in a suit. I didn't recognize him, but he had the slick confidence of a real estate developer. He gestured toward the green space, then toward my side of the fence, nodding like he'd already decided what to build there. I stayed back, hidden behind a tree line, watching them. My hands tightened into fists. They weren't just blocking me in. They were planning something behind my back. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pot of coffee. I wrote down everything I knew, dates, names, conversations. I made a map of the property, marking where the fence cut through. I listed witnesses who'd seen the fence go up. By midnight, I had a clear picture. This wasn't just about a boundary dispute. This was about pushing me off my own land. And if I didn't stop them now, they'd win. The great question was no longer, what do you do when your HOA crosses the line? It was this, how far are you willing to go to take your land back? Because from the look of things, Robert and Marcia were willing to go all the way. And that meant I had to be willing to go further. The first real sign that this fence was more than just a property dispute came from my mailbox. It was Tuesday morning, the sun barely up, when I found a plain white envelope with no return address wedged between my electric bill and a flyer for half-price pizza. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in bold font. Stop making trouble with the HOA. You're only making things worse for yourself. No signature. No name, no explanation, just a warning. By that evening, I noticed a shift in the neighborhood. George, as loyal as ever, waved to me from across the street. But others, neighbors I'd spoken to for years, suddenly wouldn't meet my eyes. Mrs. Coleman, the retired schoolteacher who used to bring me peach cobbler every summer, crossed to the other side of the road when I walked by. It was as if the fence wasn't just cutting across my land. It was cutting through relationships. 2 days later, I got my first HOA violation notice in years. Reason: unkempt vegetation near property boundary. Fine, $150. I stared at the photo attached to the notice, a blurry shot of some wild grass on my side of the fence. Never mind that the HOA had blocked me from mowing that area without dismantling their new barrier. The message was clear: if I fought them, they'd bury me in violations until I couldn't breathe. At the Friday HOA meeting, the tension was so thick you could feel it in your chest. The community center smelled of burnt coffee and dry carpet, the kind of place where the air itself seems to drain your will to live. Robert sat at the head of the table, tie perfectly knotted, that practiced politician smile on his face. Marcia was beside him, scribbling notes with the intensity of a courtroom stenographer. When my turn came to speak, I laid my evidence on the table: plats, deeds, and certified records. This fence, I said, is on my land, and I have every legal right to remove it. Robert didn't even glance at the documents. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and said, "The board's position is that the fence is protecting community property. If you remove it, we'll have no choice but to pursue legal action." His tone was polite, but his eyes said, "Go ahead, try me." That's when the meeting exploded. George stood up to back me, pointing out that the HOA had no survey to prove their claim. Mrs. Coleman, surprisingly, spoke up in favor of the fence, calling it a necessary measure to maintain order. Others started shouting over each other, voices bouncing off the cheap panel walls, accusations flying like hornets. I left before the meeting ended, my ears ringing, my heart pounding. By the weekend, the fallout was everywhere. Someone spray-painted "Land Thief" on the side of my barn in thick black letters. Another neighbor posted on the community Facebook group that I was trying to take away land mint for everyone. The worst part? People believed it. Suddenly, folks I'd known for decades were treating me like a stranger, like an enemy. Every trip into town came with stares and whispers. Even the cashier at the feed store, who used to slip me a discount on dog food, avoided small talk. And it wasn't just me. George told me that 2 other neighbors who defended me at the meeting had received violation notices for petty infractions. One for having a cracked driveway, another for leaving their trash cans out for too long. It was retaliation, plain and simple. The HOA was making an example out of anyone who sided with me. The thing about small communities is, once the cracks appear, they spread fast. Before the fence, we were a typical rural neighborhood. Folks might keep to themselves, but we'd lend a tool, share a beer, wave from the mailbox. After the fence, every interaction felt like a test. Were they for me or against me? Church on Sunday wasn't the same. The same people who used to sit beside me in the pews now left a space between us. The pastor, trying to keep the peace, offered a sermon on unity that sounded more like it was aimed at me than anyone else. Even my family started feeling it. My daughter, Emily, came home from school in tears one afternoon. She's 16, stubborn as they come, but that day, she was broken. "Dad," she said, "people are saying you're going to get arrested for stealing land." Hearing those words from her, the disbelief in her voice cut deeper than any fine or violation notice. That night, I sat alone in the barn, staring at the spray-painted wall. The air smelled of hay and oil, the quiet only broken by the occasional creak of the rafters. This was no longer about property lines or legal rights. The HOA wasn't just attacking my land. They were dismantling my life, one relationship at a time. But here's the thing about pressure: it either breaks you or sharpens you. And as I sat there, my anger settled into something heavier, something unshakable. They wanted me isolated. They wanted me scared. They wanted me to give in quietly, like so many others before me. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. If they wanted to fight, they'd get one. Next came the question that burned in my mind as I stared at that ugly fence in the moonlight. If the HOA was willing to destroy my reputation to get my land, what would I be willing to do to keep it? The turning point didn't come with some grand plan. It started with a single late-night conversation in George's garage. The place smelled of motor oil and sawdust, tools hanging neatly on pegboards along the wall. George leaned against his workbench, arms crossed, a beer sweating in his hand. "They've done this before," he said quietly, as though the fence itself might be listening. "Not the same way, but close. They push until people break. Most folks just pay the fines, sell, and leave. You give up the fight, they win." I took a slow sip from my own bottle, the bitterness settling in my chest. "So what do we do? Sit here and wait for them to run me out?" George smirked, that kind of half grin that always meant trouble. "No, we make it harder for them to breathe." That was the beginning of what I started calling the counteroffensive. Step one was information. If the HOA wanted a war of paperwork, I'd drown them in it. I spent the next week pulling every record I could find: property deeds, meeting minutes, expense reports, even old photographs from the county archives. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. I found that Robert had approved landscaping contracts with his cousin's company at twice the market rate. Marcia's son had been hired for a security consultant role that didn't exist on any public budget. And then there were the meeting minutes, carefully edited versions posted online for residents, compared against the raw transcripts I got through a records request. Words missing. Votes changed. The HOA wasn't just arrogant. They were sloppy. Step two was people. I knew I couldn't fight alone. The problem was, most folks were too scared to stand up until they realized they weren't alone either. George and I started small, a quiet dinner with a couple we trusted, Bill and Teresa, who'd been slapped with fines for having their garden too visible from the street. We showed them what I'd found. By the end of the night, Bill was grinning like a man who'd just found a loaded shotgun under the bed. From there, it spread. A whispered conversation at the feed store. A quick chat over coffee at the diner. Little by little, the circle grew. Within 3 weeks, there were 11 of us. Not enough to take over the board, but enough to make them sweat. Step 3 was visibility. If the HOA wanted to control the narrative, I'd take it out of their hands. I started posting the evidence on a blog, anonymous at first, but with enough detail that everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly who it was about. Contracts, budgets, before and after copies of meeting minutes. I even posted drone footage of the fence cutting into my land, with survey stakes clearly marking the boundary. And people were watching. The blog's traffic doubled every week. That's when the intimidation started getting personal. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. A dead rat left on my porch one morning. A nail mysteriously jammed into one of my tractor tires. But instead of backing down, I doubled down. I called the county sheriff's office and filed every incident as harassment. Then I posted the case numbers on the blog, right next to the HOA's Code of Ethics page. The real turning point came with the gate idea. It was George's brainchild, and at first I thought he was joking. "They fence you off?" he said, tapping his temple. "Fine. Make it work for you. Put a gate in it. And not just any gate, a toll gate." I stared at him. "You mean charge them to get across my land?" "Exactly. If they're going to block you, make them pay for the privilege." It sounded insane, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The fence wasn't just on my property. It cut across the only direct route the HOA had to access their so-called community land behind my ranch. Without that route, they'd have to drive nearly 2 miles around the perimeter. If I installed a legitimate, county-approved toll gate and posted the rates, I wouldn't just be proving a point. I'd be hitting them where it hurt, their wallets. The day I filed the permit application for the toll gate, I felt a strange mix of adrenaline and dread. By Friday, the county had approved it. By Monday, George and I were out there with post-hole diggers, concrete mix, and a heavy-duty steel gate I'd bought secondhand from a livestock auction. We bolted on a sign in bold black letters. Private access, $5 per vehicle. Cash only. Exact change required. I installed a motion-activated camera to record every crossing. The first time Robert pulled up in his SUV and read the sign, his face went pale. He didn't say a word, just backed up and drove the long way around. The move sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Half the residents thought it was hilarious. The other half thought I'd lost my mind. But one thing was certain, the power dynamic had shifted. The HOA couldn't touch the gate without admitting they'd built the fence on my land. And the longer it stayed up, the more residents started asking questions. Some even came to me quietly, asking how they could get out from under the HOA's thumb. For the first time in months, I felt like I had the upper hand. The HOA had pushed me into a corner, but in doing so, they'd given me the one thing I needed most, the will to fight without fear. Now, the only question left was, how far would they go to take it back? The toll gate had been standing for exactly 21 days when the first official letter arrived. It came in a thick white envelope with HOA legal department stamped across the top in bold red ink, like a warning flare. Inside, the letter was filled with the kind of language that tried to sound polite but reeked of desperation. Words like cease and desist, unauthorized obstruction, and violation of community cohesion. They gave me 10 days to remove the gate or face further legal action. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and read it twice. Then I slid the letter into a manila folder labeled Evidence, HOA Harassment, and went about my day. The difference now was simple. I wasn't afraid anymore. The final pushback. George and I didn't just ignore the letter. We went on offense. I took every piece of evidence I had, the shady contracts, the altered meeting minutes, the proof of the fence's illegal placement, and mailed copies directly to the county zoning board, the state HOA oversight committee, and, just for fun, the local newspaper. Bill and Teresa started talking at church. Another neighbor leaked his own fine notices to the blog. Pretty soon, my little corner of the internet became a war room. Residents from other HOA communities even started sending me their stories. It wasn't just about my ranch anymore. It was about a pattern, one that stretched far beyond our property lines. The courtroom moment. The HOA finally made good on their threat and took me to court. The hearing was in a cramped county courtroom that smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish. Robert was there in a tailored suit, looking like he'd practiced his concerned citizen face in the mirror. Marcia sat next to him, lips pursed so tightly they could have cut glass. When the judge walked in, the room went silent. Their lawyer made the usual arguments. The gate was in violation of HOA bylaws. It hindered access to community land. It was erected in bad faith. My turn came, and I didn't hold back. I laid out the surveyor's maps, showing exactly where my property line sat. I handed over the county's approval for the toll gate. I presented the blog printouts, the financial records, the meeting transcripts, all of it. When I got to the part about the altered minutes and the nepotism contracts, the judge's eyebrows actually rose. By the end, the room felt like it had tilted. The HOA's lawyer was shifting uncomfortably. Robert's face was a shade darker than a ripe tomato. The judge ruled in my favor, every single point. The fence, he said, was illegally placed and had to be removed within 30 days. The HOA was ordered to cover my legal fees. The gate could stay as a lawful use of the defendant's private property. I'd won. The aftermath nobody saw coming. Victory didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like silence. For the first time in months, my mornings were free of threatening letters, my nights free of strange noises outside. The blog kept running, but the posts slowed down. People were still reading, but the immediate war was over. The HOA board was in shambles. Robert resigned, for personal reasons, 2 weeks later. Marcia vanished from public life entirely. Neighbors who had avoided me for fear of getting involved now waved from their driveways. Some even stopped by with pies and casseroles, the small-town currency of apology. And yet, something in me had shifted permanently. The realization. One night, I stood by the toll gate with George, the sun setting in a burnished orange glow behind us. The air smelled of dust and warm grass. The gate creaked gently in the breeze. "You did it," George said quietly. "You beat them." I nodded. But the victory felt different now. I didn't just beat them, George. I saw what they really are. And it's not about rules. It's about control. Power for the sake of power. He took a swig from his beer. So what now? I looked down the road, past the gate, into the land that was mine, truly mine. Now, I keep the gate, not for the toll money, not even for the principal, but as a reminder that you can fight back, that you don't have to hand over your life just because some board says you should. The last crossing. 2 weeks later, Robert drove up one last time. His SUV stopped at the gate. He didn't get out, just sat there for a minute, staring. Then, slowly, he pulled a crumpled $5 bill from his wallet and fed into the cash box. The gate swung open. He drove through without a word. I stood in the shadows, watching. It wasn't about the money. It was about that moment. The man who tried to wall me in, paying me to cross my land. That was worth more than any fine, any fence, any court victory. The fence is gone now. The grass has grown back where the posts once stood. The gate remains, a silent sentinel at the edge of my ranch. Every time I see it, I think of the fight, the sleepless nights, the meetings, the courtroom showdown. And I think of the one lesson burned into me through it all. Freedom isn't something you're given. It's something you keep. Every day,